because our claim is that we are actually faithful to our scriptures. You guys are not. You want to avoid the Old Testament, and I want to give you an analogy, Patrick, because you're a business guy. You have many businesses, okay? And you have policies that you have to put in place based on social interaction in the workplace and all that kind of stuff. Now, you may make amendments to those policies based on new data, new information, how things are actually going based on those things that you put in place. Now, when you do, right, and this is the analogy between the Old Testament and the New Testament, are you willing to say that, well, yeah, thinking to myself, yeah, Pat, yeah, you were wrong, actually, when you said it was okay to do such and such. That was actually wrong, and you then put in the correct one. With the Bible, the problem that you have is the same one that you want to talk about, the loving Jesus Christ himself, which we also adore and respect as a prophet, is the same one that you believe is God and revealed the Old Testament, and you can't get out of that. So when your God, Jesus, revealed at that specific time, as I just read the passage, and I can read you plenty more, where he says to kill babies in war. Is it okay to target infants in war and kill babies? Is that inherently immoral? The problem that you have is if you go on, and this is why the argument is so important. It's not a tu quoque just as a fallacious argument. It's checking for your consistency as a Christian, whether or not you're actually faithful to your own text and tradition. And the reality is you're not. Why? You have two options. If you condemn it as inherently immoral, then the whole Bible's gone. Because if you believe that those verses in the Bible were revealed by God, then you're saying that God is immoral. And on the other hand, if you say that it's not inherently immoral, but God changed the law at this time, then most of your arguments lose the force that they have against Islam, because you can no longer argue that it is inherently immoral to punish an apostate by death and all of the other things that you want to tack on. This is why it's so important. It's not a fallacious argument, and the reality is we want to stick to our text and our tradition, and for the most part, we would argue that the Christians have abandoned them in favor of secular, liberal, moral ideologies.
But just on this point of violence, I think Jake makes really the crucial point. It's that Jesus, according to the Christian belief, Jesus is the God of the Old Testament. And he's the one who's commanding Moses, for example, to ethnically cleanse the Canaanites or the Amalekites or all of these other tribes, and to conduct conquests and war, to take girls as slaves, to take virgins as slaves. This is in the Old Testament, sure. So Christians have to deal with that moral problem. A lot of Christians, unfortunately, they just throw the Bible under the bus. And, how is that justified? But it's not just the Old Testament. It's also the New Testament. The New Testament also endorses slavery. The New Testament also has the book of Revelation, where Jesus is going to come, which, by the way, Muslims also believe that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the born of the Virgin Mary, and he's going to come as the Messiah to establish God's kingdom on earth. Muslims also accept and believe that, and we're anticipating that. But he's going to be very violent. It's going to be a very violent affair, and that's in the Muslim tradition and the Hadith, and it's also in the book of Revelation. So Jesus is also very violent. And then finally, you have canon law. You have the church tradition. So if Robert wants to denounce canon law, because when you have canon law, it has slavery, it has a marriage age of 12 years old in canon law, it has punishments for blasphemy, it has even striking the wife, the disobedient wife. That's found in canon law from Gratian. So I believe that Robert is an Orthodox Christian. If he wants to denounce canon law and denounce his own tradition, he can denounce that. He can denounce Jesus himself. He can denounce the Old Testament. He can denounce the Bible. The New Testament, that's fine. That's fine. He says that, our religion adapts, our religion changes. But that's actually the problem, Patrick. When we're talking about wokeism, when we're talking about, if you can say that, that's the Old Testament is for those times, it's not applicable now, right? That's the argument. The violence, the killing of blasphemers, that's for old times. We've changed, but Muslims are not willing to change. I say, yeah, Muslims are willing to stand by revelation. The problem with a lot of Christians, not all Christians, a lot of Christians, Jews, Hindus, they all have these practices in their books. Buddhists Buddhists, they all have these practices, and they're pressured to change and update. And so why, if you can get rid of the conquest and the violence and the punishment for apostasy, why not just get rid of the prohibition of like cross-dressing, the prohibition of homosexuality, the prohibition of drag queens? Why prohibit any of that? Like, maybe times are different. Maybe we need to adopt drag queen story hour in our church. Maybe we need to adopt, all of these woke practices. Why not? Just a few points here. Number one, it's interesting how we want to talk about Islam as a religion, but the religion is 95%, like what Jake mentioned. It's about worshiping God, being devoted to a righteous way of life, loving your neighbors, taking care of your parents. That's what 95% of Islam is about. Yes, there are criminal punishments, which we're going to discuss. There is conquest, there is war theory, there's all of this in Islam. But it's interesting how when a conversation is about Islam, we focus on that 5% instead of the 95% of what Islam is about. We don't see this kind of double standard with like Christians. So if you have someone like Matt Walsh is a traditional Christian. There's slavery in the Bible. There's punishment for blasphemers in the Bible. There's killing of heretics in the church tradition. There's no discussion of that with Matt Walsh, right? Or Ben Shapiro. There is killing of blasphemers in the Hebrew Bible. There is, punishments for apostasy in the Talmud. There's no discussion of that with Ben Shapiro. You can talk about, other values, and that's what the discussion focuses on. But the Islamophobic narrative is just lasering in on these specific topics, which is fine. We can discuss that, but I just want to note the double standard. So the other framing of this whole discussion that I want to put out here, though, is that I'm wondering, like, this standard of, there should be no punishment for blasphemy, for example. Let's just put that out there. There should be no punishment for mocking and insulting a religion, attacking people's values. Is that coming from a Christian perspective? Is that coming from is that coming from the church tradition? Is that coming from the Bible? Because when we look at the Bible, we see in Leviticus, we see in Deuteronomy that blasphemers should be put to death. Even if you entice, the Bible says, if you entice like your son or your daughter or your wife entices you to worship other than God, then have no mercy. Put them to death without due process mentioned, without any kind of court or tribunal. The husband or the father should just immediately put them to death without mercy. That's what the Bible says. So when Robert wants to criticize Islam, I'm wondering, is that criticism on the basis of the Bible? Is that on the basis of the church tradition? Or is this a liberal, secular, modernist critique of Islam? So I want to know, am I debating or discussing with two Christians or two atheists or two liberal secularists? Like, that's a clarification that we need.